probably bought tickets to us, and we are hiring. I'll just say that. Okay. So a little bit about me. I've been working on CSS for a long time. I started in 1999. I love this community, right? You know, the CSS community has been through a lot. The language is 22 years old. How many technologies can you think of that are 22 years old that are still relevant today? So I just wanted to give a nod out to some of the technologies I'm going to cover today. These are some of the new frameworks that are coming out. Just kidding. These are the languages that were trying to survive before CSS landed in '96. CSS actually won because it was the simplest of all of those dialects. So it's really amazing to see the CSS community come up with innovation after innovation to keep up with the way we were building websites. This is my first website. I built this, I remember using tables and the pre-tag. That was amazing. And it kind of like changed my life. I was a business major and I haven't done business in a while. I remember styling tables and using spacer GIFs to kind of get things perfect. And then this came out, and I don't know if you guys probably even remember this, but this is the, basically it was the idea like, hey, look, CSS can change the layout of a document. So I was like, wow, this is amazing. Blew my mind. So, but things have kind of changed, right? We don't work in documents anymore. We're all working in complex applications. We work in development teams across different companies, across different engineering groups. And I mean, how many of you work on a different engineering team and you have friends that work in a different engineering team in the same company? Okay, cool. So we can't like write one style sheet and put it on a document and ship it. So we've seen kind of changes happen in JavaScript, right? React kind of became the new hotness, and I immediately bought into it. I remember like kind of foregoing some of these other ideas, and as soon as I saw React, I was like, duh, this makes perfect sense. Kind of like everybody's kind of been talking about, Ben and everybody. And CSS is kind of going through the same process right now. It kind of feels like 1993 again to me. We have close to 59 different projects right now to style your React components. And yeah, it's crazy, right? And some of them are not going to be around for very long. There's a lot of controversy around this whole idea of CSS and JS. And the reality is you need to know CSS, right? The idea is not that let's bring CSS into JS and kind of forget about the language. You actually have to know it more than regular CSS folks, I feel like. And the other reality is you're going to have problems if you keep your CSS in CSS files. You're going to have problems if you bring your CSS into JavaScript files. There's no escape hatch that fixes everything. But what I'm here to tell you is if you do bring your CSS into React, you'll get some new superpowers. And I kind of wanted to talk about those. I'll show 5 types of the superpowers. You'll get automation. And then you'll be able to make your projects more shareable, adaptable, scalable, and maintainable. And this is all in the realm of React. And what I was thinking about is what really we're going to end up having to do is give up some control. And you know, in life, you have things where you kind of like, I can't give this control up. This is the way things need to work. But in reality, you kind of get more control, kind of like delegating. So the first idea is automation. And what I wanted to show is this guy here, since we're talking about superpowers. I don't know about you, but this is kind of how I feel nowadays when I have to write last names by hand and manage them and move them around. And it's not uncommon to like have this feeling. And this says there are only 2 hard problems in computer science, right? cache invalidation, and naming things. I mean, it's super hard. There's some truth to this. It's kind of an ironic quote from this guy, Phil Carlton from Netscape, who used to come up with these wise comments. But there's a lot of truth behind this. We have to create names all the time. We have conventions for them, but instead of a human creating these names, what if we could automate them? So that was the initial idea behind this. So let's show some code. Now, I don't know if you can see this in the back. Can you guys see okay? Thank God. Okay. There's not a lot of code. I try to keep it to a minimum. So this is a regular React file on the white section. And in the black section, you have a CSS file. And most folks, if they want to use CSS in their React, they just import the file. And class name equals button, and they use it. But what if we use a tool? So the first tool we'll look at is CSS Modules. Sorry. So the only difference there is that now, instead of importing this file, you're importing an object. What does it look like? All it is a JSON object. So you see the red is the class that you created by hand, and the orange there is automated. So and it looks a lot like BEM, or BEM. Are you guys familiar with BEM? Good. Everybody, who's not familiar with BEM? Oh, okay. BEM is the idea that you namespace your class names, block, element, modifier. And that's what I was kind of referring to before, where to create those class names by hand, it really gets mundane after a while, and you have to maintain them. So what this does is it says, you brought this BTN class in from a button file, or for my file called button.css. And so that's the first bit there on the left. And then you're referencing a class name called button. And then the last bit is just a hash so that it doesn't collide with other class names. And then how do you use this now in a real-world React app? There's a pretty handy library called React CSS Modules. And it is basically a higher order component. You can think of it as a utility that gives you additional functionality in your component. So the additional functionality is that new attribute called style name there. And instead of using class name, you can just use style name. And that way, going back to this, if you didn't use that, you would have to say styles.btn, right? Because it's the JavaScript object. This way, you just say btn, just like you were living your life before. But now you don't have to create this class name by hand. So it's automated. What ends up happening is when you render this guy, you'll get two things happen, right? So the bundled JavaScript file knows that it needs to inject some styles into the document. That's the first bit on top there. And it attaches the class that it knows exists to your HTML element. And the robot tells you that you did not have to do this by hand. If you haven't done BEM, this probably doesn't seem so cool, but it's really just automating processes. Another idea that has kind of just come out that is around the same methodology of keeping your stuff in CSS files is DCSS. And I made this file name pink there so you can kind of see. Pink there so that you can see that the file name is now capital B button.css. And the class name is capital B. And this is just convention for this type of library. And what you're getting out of this is when you import this object from a CSS file, that's kind of weird, right? How do I import an object from a CSS file? well, what you're getting out of it is a React component. So you can say, I have a new React component called myButton. It probably has some children coming in. And my button that I imported, it comes in for you via a Webpack loader as a React component. And the way you signify what kind of HTML element it should be is via the tag prop. So in this case, we want a button. And when we render this guy, we end up with a button. So this is a little less work in terms of like managing the creation of this component by hand. But overall, what we've done is automate this process. So we've gone from this to superpowers. You can do so much with this extra cognitive load that like has kind of gone away. Next, let's look at how to make CSS shareable. And who here has like worked on some CSS and realized somebody else is writing the exact same CSS in their company? More hands. Okay, good. Yeah, we want to make it shareable. And it's not shareable, right? So there's no way to like say, npm install my friend's CSS file, like currently. But this problem has already been solved in JavaScript. I mean, I don't know about you, but I probably npm installed 100 things like in the last hour. So CSS has this problem. You end up with things like Bootstrap with, it's an amazing project, but it's literally the largest project on GitHub. Once you buy into this thing, you can't get out of it. Like, you can't say, well, if you want to, let's say you want to use a Bootstrap button, you have to go through their website, check some boxes, download a thing, come back to your thing, set it all up, and then like if you decide you don't want it, you have to go back. So it's not automated, and it's not shareable. You end up with, so we automated the class name generation, but we're still saying class name equals string. So when you have this one-to-one mapping of class name to class name declaration, it gets complex as your project grows. And refactoring is like impossible. Like how do you move this thing over there if you don't know what's relying on it, or rename it, or it's like it gets really complicated. So let's look at JavaScript, because they fixed this exact same problem. I think Ben touched upon this like jQuery example earlier. So we have a button, and we want to make it do stuff. So what do? We add a ID to it, and add an event listener to it, and now it's interactive. But then we immediately realized we've kind of locked this down, right? This button is, for it to work, it needs two files. It needs some JavaScript and some HTML. And that btn string is global. So you have to start namespacing that value. And if you want to move this string, you have to go change all the references everywhere. So how do we fix this? React conf. We brought HTML into JavaScript, JSX. So we were like, OK, guess what? Let's just mix them together. People went crazy. But what we realized is like, now I can just hand you this file. It has everything you need for the logic to handle itself. So it's shippable. And moving logic around, it's simple. Like you don't have to figure out, oh, who's using this class name? So we have literally almost exactly the same problem now. And I guess, yeah. We have a limitation in CSS. And this is why Bootstrap is kind of limited, right? You can't just say, here's the thing. You've got to get the thing and attach it to your thing. So I call it glue, basically. So this is your glue. And you got to put it in the other place to match your class names. But what if we decide we don't want this glue? We just get rid of it somehow. Is there like an example we can use? Yep. Guess what? Components. So that's kind of where styled components came in and said, OK, why don't we just put your styling inside the component? That way, We've already done that with JavaScript. We'll do the same thing with CSS. This is kind of what it looks like. So styled is a object that contains properties, one for every HTML element. In this case, we create a button. And then ES6 brought in the ES6 tag template literal syntax. I don't know if you can see, it's almost like invisible. That small backtick there. Can you guys see? Yeah. So that's like the super magic sauce that they kind of used. And basically, it means this thing is a string. In this case, we just happen to put CSS in there, right? So that means you can take your CSS, just paste it in there. If you have like nested selectors, hover selectors, media queries, it doesn't matter. You just paste it in. And then the drawback to that is Style Components has a render parser that parses this every time it needs to render it and injects it into the DOM. And that's what happens there. So the big takeaway here is nowhere do you have class name equals. It's in the component. So let's say we have a library called shared. We import it. You could have literally called that Bootstrap lib. And then you want to use it. So the other benefit of Style Components is that you can wrap a component as opposed to a HTML element. Kind of like, I think we were talking about JSX before, so it's the same thing. And in this case, we're wrapping it, and we want it to have additional styling. So we can render the old one and the new one, so that you can see how this becomes shareable. So if this kind of tag template literal thing scares you, I think tomorrow Kent will be here. He created a library called Glamorous. And what this does is basically replace this tag template literal with a real JavaScript object. I mean, tag template literals are JavaScript, but this is a real JavaScript object. And the only difference there is you can see your CSS selectors have to be camel cased because you're in JavaScript now. And a little bit more syntax. You have like single quotes, commas, and stuff like that. But there are, the community has already created tools for all this stuff. You can literally paste the stuff into VS Code and have it replace all this stuff for you. And the output is the same. One thing that I'll call out is debugging is a little bit easier with Glamorous. As you can see in the box on the right, it says CSS-glamorous-button. So when you're debugging in DevTools, you'll know that this is coming from a button. I'll go back quickly to this one. This one's just like gibberish. So it's a little bit harder. I found that when I'm working on Style Components, I love Style Components. So there's like small, tiny differences here and there, but it's pretty much all the same thing. Emotion took the idea of like, I don't want to choose. Why don't I give you both options? So the first example, base, is using JSON notation. And this is almost like supposed to be an example of sharing. So let's say base was your styled system in your company. You import that and then extend it with your functionality. CSS is also a little bit more advanced in emotion, so that if there's let's say a font weight rule on the second one, it dedupes it for you, so you don't end up with these like overwriting rules in the browser. And yeah, we just inherit that and render it. So now we've seen a few different ways of creating components with different libraries. Next, I'm going to show you the adaptability power, and I got a little story. My wife actually pointed this out. So this lizard, his name is Anoli, and he's probably one of the most adaptive animals in the planet, I feel like. They used to live in Florida on these tree branches, and these other hostile lizards showed up from somewhere, and they kind of intimidated them. And these guys, they just kind of moved up the tree. They went to the higher branch. And problem was these higher branches are like super slippery and thin. So within the span of 15 years, they literally like almost doubled the size of their thumbs, and they grew like these scales on them, and so they were like literally happier up there because there was like this entire untapped resource. And but it's kind of crazy because it's the comparison that they make is like as if all of us grew 1 foot in the span of like 10 generations. Basically, we'd all be like basketball players. So let's see how CSS and JS makes it easy to like create code that can adapt to its environment. I'm going to show you 3 examples. So styled system is one of the first things that caught my attention. It kind of adapts to inputs and is great for setting up new layouts in your project. So if you're like starting a brand new project, and let's say you want to use CSS and JS, this is a pretty good library. It's actually built on top of styled components. So we're kind of already seeing this sharing happening, in the community. Here's the use case of a helper for width. So let's take a look at this. So on the second line there, we're importing width from styled system. So what is width? We're using it when we create a div that turns out, we call it a box. But instead of telling div we want you to be, at this media query be this size, at this media query be this size, we're literally putting all that logic in width and importing that from styled system. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. So you can the idea is like you can abstract away some of this system-wide logic. And this works really good if you're trying to create like a new layout system for your company, for a project, for a client. And then these values, responsive widths, can come from anywhere. Like it could come from a GraphQL query, it can come from a database. And basically it's self-explanatory there. So width, you can pass it like an actual number. You can say width should be 10, and then it uses a grid system that you can configure, or you can pass it an array, and it gives you responsive widths. And going back to the whole React world, this is also very declarative. So when you see box width is responsive width, you don't need to go, oh, well, where's the CSS for this, and what happens over here? No, it's just know. It goes from 100% to 50%, 25%. Pretty simple. So now what about, like, this is the big one, right? We need to like have some state logic in our CSS. So let's say something changed. We re-render the thing, but we want to change the layout of the CSS as well. And traditionally, you just do this in inline styles. You say style equals color red or something. But now that if we're going to use libraries, we can use something like this. So the first pink one is basically like a styled input. You can imagine like you want just generic input styling on stuff. And then the second one says, I'd like to create something called password. And it's going to need some placeholder text. And then on top of that, it's kind of like, I was telling someone at the break, style components kind of reminds me of jQuery a lot. And it's kind of like fun to use and, Okay, so then border color is black. And then now we can say if your props are red, let's make it red. So this is basically like server sending you back an error response. You change your state, change the prop, change the styling. Okay. And then the same thing you can do with DCSS. It's a lot cleaner. The trick is that you actually create these hyphen classes in your CSS file. And then once you pass that through, so this is how you would use DCSS with Webpack, literally just one line DCSS loader. And then you say button danger. So then it knows to use the button hyphen danger class in your CSS file. This is good if you don't want to move to CSS and JS. And then a lot of times you need global styling, I want all my items to have border box. So there are helpers for injecting globals into the page, or let's say you're using a Bootstrap nav and it needs to have a nav class, so you can use the colon global style as well. And then last thing is maintainable. So I'll talk about 4 things that you can get out of CSS in React. First one is dead and unused CSS. How many people know what that even is? Cool. OK, I have a simple example. Hopefully it helps. So let's say you have an old-fashioned import CSS file. You have 2 components, and then you render them. Everything is fine. Then somebody says, guess what? You know what? We don't need this other component. Our sales are going down. Let's remove it. So we just remove it. But you notice the CSS still exists on the right side, and it gets rendered onto the client. So this is a contrived example. It's very simple. You should probably go delete C2 from your input. But the component is still there, so I will just keep it around. So this becomes unused CSS. It gets delivered into the payload. Now, it gets worse if you decide, you know what, let's just delete this thing. We don't need it. Nobody's using it. I'm going to delete it. But if you don't go and delete the CSS file, now you have dead CSS. Ooh, scary. Yeah. So, and this is, again, very simple, but it gets hard to keep track of this stuff because we have class name. So the same example with style components. We render 2 components. They come with their own styling. We render 1. They don't come with any styling. So you automatically get no dead CSS ever. The only exception to this is, in this example, the bundled JavaScript library will still have C2 because you have it there. So you'll have to use Uglify to kind of remove unused code. And then you also get critical CSS. Critical CSS basically says, if I'm not using you on this render, don't give me styling for yourself. So this is a huge win. You can try to get critical CSS in non-CSS and JS projects, but it's really complicated. You have to write crawlers, and this is just automatic. OK, so we're going to hear a lot more about testing later, so I'll go through this one pretty quickly. But snapshot testing basically says, take a picture of this state, and later on, as I change my app, if it doesn't match that state, let me know, and I can take a look at it and see why it changed. With styling, you can actually snapshot test pretty easily. The first example just says the button should match its snapshot. Yeah, it shouldn't change. But what's really cool is you can say, I want to make sure that this button always has a pink color. So this is helpful if you have things like style design systems where you don't want things to be changing a lot. But on a product, when you're always changing, experimenting, this probably doesn't make sense. So there's your tests. They pass, and everything is good. And then finally, you can, if your project starts scaling, right, you want to make sure that CSS and JS has your back, and you get a couple superpowers. Serverside rendering, Ben definitely mentioned before. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that your time to first render doesn't get affected. So if you keep all your CSS in your JavaScript bundle, nothing renders until the browser downloads the JavaScript file, injects a bunch of styles into the page. The browser says, OK, here's some styles, and then repaints the page with all the styles. But with server-side rendering, we're already doing that, right? Hopefully, if your company is doing that. That's the first bit with render to string. So you can also wrap that with render style to string. And this case is emotion. And then what you get out of that is your entry routes, so basically your critical CSS in a string format. And then you just spit that out. And you're like, well, what's the point? I can already do that with CSS. But what's cool about this is that you're already AMP compliant. So AMP, have you guys heard of AMP? Google's thing. So it's accelerated mobile pages. The requirement has a bunch of requirements. But one of the hard ones is no external style sheets. So what most people do is just inline their entire CSS file. But you don't want to do that. So with this, you automatically get critical CSS inline for free. And then right to left support. So if you go to a different country and you're like, we're going to change our strings to Spanish or Arabic, that's fine, but what about styling? Let's say you have left padding on all your content, and people are like, well, what is this? Like, I don't have any padding on this side. I read from this side. So what's cool about CSS and JS is that it's just JavaScript. And there's many libraries. This one is actually also created by Kent. Kent's an awesome dude. And he basically just takes your horizontal style rules and inverts them for you. So in this case, we have margin left, border left, and even linear gradients gets inverted. Themes are nothing new. Like SASS users all have themes and everything. But what's cool with JavaScript theming, you can like do some magic stuff. Like you can create colorblind themes and have users generate their own themes on the fly and things like that. Here's an example that shows Glamorous giving you the option to pass in the dark theme and render it, or pass in a light theme and render it. And you can't have a CSS and JS talk without talking about React Native. I'm not going to talk too much about it. Just know that it is an option. Here's a quick, kind of like a hello world example. So you've got, instead of a div, you have a view. And instead of using inline styles, you're using styled components. So if you're kind of buying into this process, later on you decide you want to write React Native for web, or anything like that, it's all the same language. And then I have this quote. React is such a good idea, we will spend the rest of the decade continuing to explore its implication and applications. Guillermo from Next tweeted this out. I mean, this hit home for me a lot. Like, I feel like, we were back in '93 and people were just like, oh, we got to figure this out. I feel like right now, especially in the CSS world, we're in this like first quarter of a game that's probably going to like go to overtime. There's going to be like some stuff going down, but we're going to see some score changes. We're going to see subs and people are going to get injured, but hopefully at the end, I think we're going to come out pretty strong and figure out something different. Here's the wrap up. So I talked about the superpowers. Those are the frameworks and libraries that were used. And these are the people that kind of basically are making all this happen. Kent will be here tomorrow. Or maybe he's here today. No, that's it. And but the last thing is this repo on the bottom. If you ever want to like just play around with this stuff and you don't want to spend too much time figuring out which one to use, I just created this. So you can like clone it and play around. Thank you.